fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren. Heard on KCA 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery. I'm Al Warren, and we got the old Joe Goldberg back again.
Yeah, older. I'm in the house.
The older.
I'm out of practice, Al. I've been off for so long that I hope I can live up to the standards that you've set for the show. It's been so long.
Well, that ain't going to be hard. Come on.
That's why I was waiting for that answer.
Yeah, ain't. Well, listen.
I'm out there for you.
What is the, Christmas, New Year's? What happens with the Goldberg house over the season of joy?
Well, some people travel to exotic places and islands, and we pack up and drive to beautiful downtown Kokomo, Indiana, to go see the grandkids and sit and watch the grandkids run around, and then realize that there's only so much grandkids you can take, and then you drive back home. But they came with us, so we had like 2 weeks of the family. It was great. It was actually great, and do your best. You realize that once again the cliches are true. It's good to be a grandparent, and small children are for the young. That's
right.
kind of what I got. How about you?
You can give them back. Oh, me!
Yes.
I make the place all really dark, and I just hang out with my dog, and I write.
I tried to do that. I'm outlining, finishing up the outline today. I'm assuming because you live out in like the forest, you chop down a tree somewhere and drag it back on your sled and things like that.
No, that's too much work for me at this point in my life. No tree chopping. No. Turn on the TV and we'll write. That's it.
Yes. Lots of sports, lots of football. Watch my Iowa Hawkeyes go down ignominious defeat.
Well, there you go. See, you got it all. You got it all.
We have Caitlin Clark go for women's basketball, so let's get off of that. See you later.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Yeah. Well, today we are covering a new book in a series, or a newer book. I guess it came out in 23. I have to keep remembering that's last year now, right?
Yeah, I had that problem too.
Yeah, well, it goes fast. Listen, so we've got the book is called The Great Unmaking, and it's the Course of Empire Series, Book 3. So with us is the author of that book, Brian A. Nelson. So thank you for being here, Brian.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Joe. Great to be here.
Listen, Brian, let's start out with you. What kind of a writer do you put yourself? How do you describe yourself if someone says, "Oh, you write? What do you write?"
So I write a variety of things. I do fiction and nonfiction. The first book I wrote was about Venezuela. I lived in Venezuela for a couple of years working on that book. And it's a clocked account of the coup, the uprising against Hugo Chavez back in 2002. So he was very unpopular at that time, and there was a huge mass march to try to oust him. And then a bunch of people ended up dying, and the military tried to boot him out, and he was sort of arrested, and then was going to be shipped to Cuba, but then at the last moment he sort of miraculously returned, and then consolidated power, and then he and his cronies have been sort of in power ever since. So that was my first project. And then I also work on fiction, and that is more of the like military thriller side. A little bit Michael Crichton-y in the sense that I geek out on a lot of technology and research, and I try to integrate that into interesting novels about how technology is changing the world.
It also sounds like, with your nonfiction, it almost blends into what you do with military thriller. Like it's kind of an influence anyway, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I found that, I had actually was supposed to write a novel when I got to Venezuela. That was what my grant stipulated I was supposed to do. But I sort of deviated from that and wrote the nonfiction. And it was very fascinating and kind of liberating to do nonfiction because when you're doing fiction, you're always sort of second guessing yourself and doubting and saying, oh, would the character say that, or would they not, or does that work or not? And when you, as you know, probably when doing nonfiction, you're just like, okay, this is what happened. This is how I need to report it. So it takes a lot of the weight off you when you get to do nonfiction.
Which one did you personally like better? Which one do you personally like better, fiction or nonfiction?
You know, I kind of oscillate back and forth. So I sometimes wish I could, do more nonfiction. But when this series came out, I was offered 3 books, so I've stayed on that track. But yeah, I really enjoy, and the other thing about it is that it's much more, doing nonfiction is much more cooperative. Like, you're going out, you're meeting people, you're setting up interviews, you're traveling, and that's I think a little bit healthier for you sometimes than when you're sitting in your office by yourself in your own little world. So I do miss doing a lot of that nonfiction, a lot of it for the personal interaction side of it.
Oh, totally. I agree. That's the best part of doing nonfiction. Fiction, you can do anywhere really, and you don't get out as much. I personally agree with you. And the other thing is, you're right. It takes the pressure off, because you're just writing what they did and what they said and how they did it and all that. So you don't have to create anything to make it sound good.
Yeah, absolutely. And I sort of remember this moment where I was interviewing a man who had been involved in this march in Venezuela. He had tragically lost his son, who was shot that day. But he had just sort of said some things about why he had been marching, and how, he was a patriot, and that he believed in Venezuela, and that because of his patriotic feelings, he would die for Venezuela. And I thought, well, wow, I probably would never have made a character say that, because it might have come off as, kind of jingoistic. But I'm like, you said it, so it's going in there, and I don't have to worry about it,
Yeah, exactly. That's the relief of it all, because if you write it in a character, you're always analyzing, would he really say that? Is this good dialogue? You kind of go through that. So listen, now we get into this series. This is book 3, so this is a series you're doing. Let's start with that. What exactly is this series about? Maybe give a little bit of an outline of what Empire series is, The Course of Empire.
Right. So basically, it's a series of books that looks at a group of military leaders and scientists who are developing the next generation of weapons. And so the first book is really an arms race between the United States and China, as they both try to sort of be the first one to create this new merging of 3 principal technologies, which is AI, genetic engineering, and nanotechnology. So it's very much a book about how science advances, how technology grows. It's looking at all sort of different aspects of it. There's a lot of good action in it. I mean, there's a lot of gunfights, and even in this book, this last book is sort of the culmination of the 3, and ends up as an apocalypse story, when this technology sort of gets out of hand. But the underlying themes are looking at how technology changes us, how it sort of tends to develop a life of its own, and, of course, how things can spiral out of control despite your best intentions.
Well, that's kind of my question. You've got 3, probably the leading technologies in the world is facing right now. As you write your theme, are you trying to be predictive in your fiction as you're writing it?
Yeah, actually. I mean, obviously, the ultimate goal is to entertain. So if this stuff will happen this quickly or as dramatically, I hope not. But in the sense of trying to find out how stuff works, how it would come together, talking to subject matter experts, and trying to sort of predict, definitely. So the books all begin in 2026. So we sort of begin at a period a little bit farther out than where we are, but basically based on everything that's kind of available right now. So yeah, it's definitely trying to sort of predict how things might develop.
Do you feel like kind of a pressure to be realistic, like in your descriptions and what you think is going to happen and how you do it? And does that give you a fear of being maybe something changes differently while the book's out or the series out, and it kind of outdates it.
Yeah, that's always a risk. Yeah. But for the most part, I think as long as you're trying to get into the science and represent it as accurately as you can, I think it works well, in the sense that the reader will go along, even if there's some sort of inaccuracies. So the first book, it was published in 2018. And at that point, there wasn't like backgrounds in for Zoom calls, right? Which is now everybody knows you can change your backgrounds, and so that was kind of like this revolutionary idea I had like back in 2016, right? And so anybody reading that book now is go, oh wow, this is in the future. There's new backgrounds for your Zoom calls, right?
You can change your background. What's that?
Yeah. But some of the technology, is actually more interesting if you delve into it a little bit more. For example, nanotechnology, I think, tends to get a bit of a bad rap because maybe, Star Trek or whatever, it just sort of comes in as a sort of magic, the nanobots came in and they fixed whatever problem the characters had, right? But when you look at nanotechnology, a little bit closer, it's actually extremely fascinating. And extremely probable that it will happen soon. And this is going back to like Richard Feynman back in the 50s, the famous Nobel physicist saying, really there's no reason why this shouldn't happen, because it's already happening within us. So the idea that there's these tiny machines that move atoms around actually is happening every minute of our lives. Every time you blink, you're breaking down ATP to ADP. Every time any nutrient is moving across a cell wall in your body, that is the technology that they're modeling this after. So it's actually quite fun to create these sort of scenes with the scientists sort of piecing these things together. And of course, the fun thing about that too is it opens up all these kind of opportunities to talk about what it means to be human, how fast technology is evolving, how it's changing us. And that's kind of some of the underlying themes that I enjoyed putting into the books.
Well, there you go, Brian. You got my next question.
Yeah.
Because you're known for your research. What do you enjoy writing, or how do you interact between people and technology? Is it harder for you to write people than it is to write the technology? How do you make them interact with each other?
Yeah. That's a good question. And it actually comes relatively easily, in part because most of the characters are scientists, right? So it allows you to sort of have them be in an action scene in 1 minute, in a helicopter crashes or whatever, and then the next minute, they can be thinking about the technology as things are happening. So you have to get that kind of balance, right? You don't want to feel like you're just dumping, right? Data dumping. But as long as the characters have a reason to be thinking about the technology and the science, it tends to flow pretty well.
Now, the last person that was on the show yesterday has as kind of an idea of the same type of thing with AI and futuristic stuff. But with him, AI, as it got so advanced, instead of killing humans or destroying the world and all that, it decided it was too good for humans, so it just quit humans.
Huh.
Well, anyway, so
like you do.
Yeah,
exactly. I'm over it. But why I bring that up is, how do you write a personality for your AI?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I really wanted to make sure that the AI in this book wasn't, wringing its hands, out to get people. It becomes sentient, and then its immediate decision is to kill everybody, right? And I didn't want to sort of Agent Smith versus Neo, or even like a HAL 9000 versus, Walden in 2001, right? So I wanted to make the AI, basically all the AI in the book is doing exactly what it's programmed to do. And it's much more about the people, the different agendas that the people have in using it that cause the problems. So it's much more about, for example, there's a character, Riona Finley, who's essentially like an eco-terrorist. So she kidnaps some of the scientists so that she can use it to reverse climate change. And another character is actually a young girl who had a rare genetic disease, and her mother works at the military with this technology and sort of illegally used the technology to give her gene therapy. And so she sort of wakes up from being ill and then realizes that there's something else in her head. The AI was supposed to die off after it cured her, but it's sort of still in her, trying, and as she goes about her life, it's still trying to fix her. So she has to deal with this sort of thing inside her. And that metaphor, actually, I think is probably the most interesting, in that we should probably look at AI as we look at children, as we look at infants. That, we think about how good is the AI system? Okay, it's as good as the training data that you give it. And so I think there's going to be sort of juvenile AI, right? There's going to be AI that's sort of at the teen phase that hasn't really figured out what's right and wrong, hasn't really figured out, doesn't have enough life experience to make good decisions. So that AI that's in Emma ends up being a very interesting sort of wild card in the story and how things fall together.
Well, for your novice, not tech reader, what do you have as because your explanations and these technologies are complicated. Mm-hmm. They can be complicated. When you bring them in a fiction story, they become more complicated. You have to explain them.
Yeah.
How much, do you think about your reader into how much tech do you actually put into this thing so you don't have their eyes start rolling back in their head saying, I can't take this anymore? Yeah,
and I don't know if during this interview I'm going a little too much off on it, but yeah, I think it works. I think that's one of the things I do well. It's just one of the things that I spend a lot of time thinking about it, and I don't let it. It's kind of easier to talk about in an interview, but it's also something that tends to work pretty seamlessly. As I said before, as long as the characters have a reason to be, working with this stuff and talking about it, then it works well. Yeah.
When you were writing nonfiction and you were kind of telling a story, there was kind of a point to it. There's mm-hmm. action and things that happen and stuff. So when you're doing this fictional sort of series, are you still trying to tell a story? Is there a subtext to the whole series or one of the books?
Yeah. So the first book is this pretty intense arms race between the U.S. and China. So you have an admiral in the U.S. And you have a general in China, and they're both sort of in this cat and mouse game trying to sort of outdo each other. They're both trying to have their teams reach this goal first, but then they're also trying to sabotage each other. So, the Chinese general sends like a commando team to the Naval Research Lab in DC and tries to wipe out the scientists. And then there's a quid pro quo. He later kidnaps some of the U.S. scientists and takes them to China. And that sort of creates an opportunity within the Chinese system to sabotage it, because they're able to double cross the Chinese. So that's just an example in the first book. The second book is a little bit more of a look at character development for the main character. His name's Eric Hill. He's a young scientist, and he's on a mission to Africa, and he is in a helicopter crash, and he's sort of picked up by this Khoisan tribe. And that I had initially thought would just be a small part of the book, but once I started to do the research on that group and sort of learned about their situation, it actually became perfect, because this is a group that has essentially lived without technology its almost complete existence. So here you have a character who's an early adopter, believes in technology, believes that technology is the answer, and now he's sort of living with a group where there is no technology. So, and again, this gets back to this idea I mentioned before about what it means to be human and how our technological society is changing us. Are we designed, for example, to sit in a car for 2 hours a day, or stare at a screen for 12 hours a day, or be sedentary, right? So it created this really neat contrast between how we're programmed to live and how we actually live. And I would argue that the bigger the gap between human evolution and the evolution of our technology, kind of the more miserable we become as a species.
Certainly, Joe.
I'm miserable all the time, so this doesn't really help.
Yeah, since he's been on TikTok, he's just been a real miserable. Okay.
Yeah, I've been laying around.
Yeah, he gets on there and dances.
It's just too crazy for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So listen, Eric Hill. Eric Hill's the main character of yours. So where did he come from? Like, who is he? And maybe describe what kind of a relationship you have with that character. Like, how do you hear him, see him, interact with him, or do you?
Yeah, Eric is a little bit of the everyman, right? He's a little bit of the vessel. So I would actually say, and I don't know if I'm smart in saying this at all, but he's a little bit less formed than a lot of the other characters. For example, Admiral Curtis, is this post-PTSD, traumatized admiral. So his character is kind of very kind of archetypical and in some ways easy to write. And some of the other scientists are a little bit more caricatures. One's an egomaniac, for example. So he's sort of easy to write. But Eric is a little bit tougher because you do want to create that sense that he could be any reader, right? The reader has to use that character as an avatar. So obviously he has a little bit of the author in him, but I drew him a little bit more vaguely probably than some of the other characters. He's a little bit of a wimp sometimes, because I have to think about a scientist who's someone who gets thrown into, combat situations or situations where he's, kidnapped or tortured. And so he's not reacting to this like a Jack Reacher character would. He's a lot more vulnerable to this sort of to sort of real traumatizing situations.
Yeah, sort of like me.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're a trauma.
One big trauma. Certainly not a Jack Reacher. Well, it's interesting how you do that. Now, when you talked about the action and stuff, do you think about the violence or the killing and the action that you do write and how you write it or present it?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because the first book with the China U.S. rivalry has some pretty brutal scenes in it. There's some torture scenes, and my father read the book and he's like, "I had no idea you could think up something like that." He was a little bit shocked by it. Some of that though came from research, so I had not known a whole lot about the Chinese government and China's relationship to its citizens and to Tibet until I did the research for this book. And there actually was a period I was like, well, should I make China the bad guy or to the Chinese government the bad guy? And then I started doing the research and I was really shocked by a lot of the stuff I read. A lot of the torture the government does, a lot of the killing, the way they use the prison systems, for example, to incarcerate political prisoners. And so a lot of that violence that was depicted in the book was actually trying to be true to some of the firsthand accounts that I read about victims of the government.
Are there things that you do your research, whether it's on the technology side or perhaps your Chinese research, but that you say, you know what, maybe this shouldn't be in the book. I don't want to write this. I'm not going to say self-cancel. That's sort of a cliche phrase, but it's just things like, I'm keeping this out.
Generally, no. I try to be as, I look at my writing as my thing, and maybe my own therapy or my own sort of time with my mind, right? That I'm with my mind and I'm thinking about what's right and wrong and what I can do. And I generally don't feel like I've ever had to sort of cut anything out that I felt was appropriate to the story. And I think, as long as it feels right to the characters, as long as it feels right to the subject matter that you're talking about, I've generally put it in. There was this problem. I did have an editor come at me for the second book. There is a scene. It's not on camera. It's actually off camera. But I have a character go to a school, what they believe is a school, and there's been a group of children who have been tortured. And we don't see any of the torture, but we see the children come out, and some of them are missing fingers and limbs. And this was something that Admiral Curtis's characters, as you might remember, he's a very pragmatic military leader, and that he will do whatever he thinks is necessary. And that basically he had kidnapped the leaders of different factions in Syria, and there's a fictional war that the U.S. has with Syria. And to get peace, he basically kidnapped the different leaders' children and forced them to sign a peace agreement. And the children were kept in the school to keep the peace. And so that was a pretty kind of, again, it wasn't on camera, but it was depicted pretty closely. And I did get some flack for that, and I had to sort of go back and forth with them. Luckily, they gave the book to a different editor, because that editor was actually trying to block it. She was actually said, "You can't do this." And the other editor said, "It's fine. I like it." So it went through.
Back off.
Yeah.
That is kind of dark thinking, though. I think your dad had a
Yeah. And I think, and that's part of being in character, right? You're an admiral. You're leading, major combat operations in another country. And in this case, what happened to Curtis was he lost like 200 Marines in a day. What would you do to make sure that didn't happen again? What lengths would you go to protect your soldiers and that you feel like, are under your command? And that actually, there is a historic precedent for that. Manuel Noriega did that. When in Panama, he was arrested, and there was a coup. Essentially, a bunch of military leaders got him, and he said, "I need to make a phone call before you do whatever you're going to do with me." And in his one phone call, he called a friend who basically rounded up the families of all the generals who had arrested him, and said, "If you don't let me go, I'm gonna kill all your families." So
we admit those are the days.
Yeah.
Well, these are complex books, and it's even more complex by putting together as a series. But they're kind of a standalone book, sort of, in the series, right?
Yeah.
How I read them. So, did you know where you were going? I mean, I don't want to answer the outline or the seat of the pants or answer, but did you have an idea of your character development or the story development, or that just kind of come to you as you're going? Especially if Eric, as you said, is an unformed character.
Right. So the first book was a situation where I had some ideas for a longer book that I'd kind of worked on in graduate school. So I had some concepts, but I'd actually made the first book to be pretty much just a standalone. And then the Blackstone, when they read it, they said, "Oh, is there more of this?" And I was like, "Oh, of course, yes, there's tons more." And so that became, so I knew the second and third books, I planned those out pretty well together at the same time. So I knew kind of where I was going. I actually don't like to outline too much. I mean, I know essentially what has to happen towards the end, but one of the things I enjoy about writing is kind of not knowing the middle and working out the middle and the steps to get to that end. So I try not to exhaust myself in outlining, because I find that it might limit me in what I actually end up writing, and that it's good to kind of go off on tangents sometimes and let yourself explore as you're going along.
Yeah, I'm at the personal story. I'm not much of an outliner either. I kind of know where I'm going. I write fiction. I did write espionage, but I'm changing a little bit. And I've been told I need to write an outline for this next book, more of an outline, like 12 pages. And my brain is exploding, because I'm like you. I don't want to know I don't know what happens then. Even if it's an outline and it can be wrong, that's not the way my brain works. I'm writing the book in my head. So this whole middle part, I kill myself trying to make it right. But it doesn't have to be, because I'm used to just writing it out.
Yeah.
So it's really a transition, and I'm struggling. So for those who are, in between, I know your pain, because I'm trying to transition to a different style myself.
Yeah.
Is it different, Al, are you guys for nonfiction, outlining and things like that?
Well, actually, my advice to you, can you get away with just making a bunch of stuff up in the middle and then changing it later?
I am kind of doing that, but it's not the way I work. It's this doesn't make sense. I'm too common. They wouldn't do this. So I'm like, and I'm actually putting too much into it to avoid getting pounded to do it again, because I don't want to do it again.
Yeah.
So it's like, I don't even know if it's first person, third person, or a mix yet. So don't ask me. But but once again, is outlining for you nonfiction? Is it different when you're going forward?
Yeah, to outline nonfiction, that would be something where I would feel I'd have to block it out a lot better, right? You've got to know, okay, who do I have to talk to, or where am I going to get this information? What if I can't get the information? How would I modify it? So I with nonfiction, I would definitely say you've got to have your ducks in a row. But the good thing is, right, you can sell a nonfiction project with just an outline, and your fiction projects, as I understand it, you really got to write the whole book out before anybody's gonna want to buy it.
Yeah, you got to be careful. I think plus you got to decide with nonfiction, but even fiction, you got to decide who's telling the story. You're writing and you're telling a story, right? And so who's going to be telling the story in the nonfiction? Who are you writing it for? Who you're trying to? And a lot of times in nonfiction, you're writing about the people that were murdered or whatever happened to them, like the victims.
Yeah, and you feel a strong connection to do that justice, right? To do that. Yeah.
And you don't have that in the fiction as much.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. What can you say?
Yeah.
And speaking of, so this is the next question here to help maybe your father whether he should get a complete security system or something to protect himself from you. But, so when you're writing the bad people, the characters, the evil, the ones that do the bad torture to the kids or whatever they're doing in the book, how do you get into that mindset? Like, how do you write that sort of stuff?
As I sort of alluded to before with the Manuel Noriega stuff, there's usually some sort of inspiration, some sort of crime or thing that's happened in the past that sort of seeds that idea. And then I sort of try to take it from there. And I think, doing that dark side, it's good to have motivation, right? So in the first book, the General Mang, he's the Chinese counterpart to Curtis. He is pretty sadistic too, and but he has a backstory. And his backstory was that his wife and child were murdered during an uprising while he was stationed in Tibet. They were accidentally killed, but he holds a deep bitterness against Tibetan people because of that. And so once that sort of backstory is locked in for that character, it's a little easier to make them be as vindictive and cruel as they are, because you can kind of understand why. And that's something that often doesn't come across, especially in cinema, right? A movie starts and suddenly there's a bad guy just murdering people in cold blood, right? And you're like, what's going on? What's making this person tick, right? And it becomes a little unsatisfying when there's just a killer with no sort of reason for it, or no sort of understandable backstory to it. I don't know. Would you agree with that, or do you feel that there is just?
Oh, totally. And just sometimes it even wrecks the story if you don't understand the person, the bad person, kind of what drives them, why they feel this way, what's happened to them. If you don't understand it, I think it leaves a big detail out, and you're missing a lot, and it becomes just a pure action killing sort of book, and it's not, or movie or show, and I sort of lose my interest in that.
Yeah, me as well.
Yeah, but remember, a bad person never knows they're bad.
Right.
They usually doesn't know they're bad. They're just doing their thing.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So that to them, if you're going to be that character, to them it must make logical sense, right? So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you got to relate to the character, even if you don't like what they do. You got to understand them. So I think anyway, that's kind of how I picture it. It doesn't always work, but in general it does, So how many books are you going to do in the series, or do you kind of have that mapped out?
So this series is wrapped up. The Course of Empire series is wrapped up. I've left a few, loose ends. So if there was, a book deal, then I can jumpstart it, because it basically ends with the end of the world with a handful of survivors. So there's definitely, most of the main characters have survived. and there are sort of opportunities to let them sort of move out and explore this new world that's been created through this mixture of AI and nanotechnology. So, but I'm actually working now on a fantasy book. So I'm actually having a lot of fun with it. It's it's a lot more world building than I've ever had to do before, and it's a lot more kind of linguistically interesting because you're having to look up a lot of words, look at roots of words, look at Old Saxon and Norse roots, and it's been quite fun that way. And I used to teach a lot. When I used to teach university, I taught a lot of Joseph Campbell, a lot of structuralism, and archetypical story structure. And I've always kind of stayed away from it in my own writing, But now I'm sort of like, okay, am I good enough to write something that's archetypical, that doesn't feel too archetypical, right? Trying to make it fresh and original in this sort of classic high fantasy setting.
How long did it take you to do each one of these, roughly?
So, so the first book in the series.
Every author laughs about that.
Yeah, that's
the funny.
They're getting faster. They get faster. So the first book I started as a draft in graduate school. So I started drafting that thing in 2000. And then I went to Venezuela in 2004. I did the book on Venezuela. That was published. My wife and I had a child, and then I was sort of stuck at home a lot. So I dusted off the manuscript I'd work on in graduate school, and that became The Last Swordmaker. But it wasn't until 2018 that got published. So that's, however you want to look at it, you could argue that it took me 18 years to write that book. The next one took a year and a half. The other one took 11 months. So things are getting better. I seem to be getting better at this as I go along.
Well, there's got to be a little bit more confidence each time you publish a book, right? You got to get more comfortable and when you attempt and you're going to write a book or outline something, or you got to have more. It just comes easier, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And a big part of it is confidence, right? You're doubting yourself less. You're letting yourself go, saying, I'm not going to worry about it now. I'll worry about it in the next edit. So there's a lot of little techniques that I think you acquire when you just kind of relax in and have more confidence in yourself.
Exactly. So that leads me to the question, even for your series and maybe your new fantasy work, where did you start? Did you start with the characters? Did you start with the plot? And did you start with the world that you're creating in the fantasy? Where did you start to build your story, to build your book out?
A lot of the Course of Empire trilogy was sort of questions about the future, like what could happen if this technology takes off, or and how could you make that? And the big challenge is, how would you make that interesting? How do you make that engaging to readers? So I think for me, it comes from different things for each project. So for each one, I try to challenge myself with, say, the cultural themes. What themes do I want to look at for this book? So in the first book, a lot of the stuff I hadn't anticipated ended up being about China and Tibet. In the second book, it ended up being about this Khoisan tribe in Africa, which kind of surprised me. And then the third one was a lot more looking at AI and how AI would develop. So for each book, I want to pick something that I don't particularly know a whole lot about, but I want to learn about, and I try to build that into the book. The last book, the fantasy book, is a little bit about midlife. I had my sister died about a year and a half ago. I had a good friend die last year. And so the idea with part of the motivation for this fantasy book is to kind of study philosophy, or bring in some philosophy about what it means to be halfway, or a little bit farther than halfway through. Like, there's less years ahead of you than there are behind you, and how you're going to deal with that. And when you're dealing with fantasy, things can be kind of interesting because different characters live, or different races live, different time periods. So you can have a race of elves, for example, that live 400 years. And so the idea of second chances is always there. I always have time to go and do the next thing. I can fail at this thing and I have another chance. But if you're human, and you're in your 50s and you're like, okay, I've really only got one last chance at this probably, and then it's over. So it's been fun to, I don't want to sound morbid about it because of the motivation behind it, but it's been a kind of philosophical adventure to go into fantasy, which again is sort of, I think, is kind of primal to us. There's sort of something in us that kind of gravitates to fantasy, but also sort of self-exploring in the sense of philosophy and how the best way to live your life when it's going to be wrapping up.
Well, there's also the advantage of we're able to have a midlife crisis. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because there's so many people that have never, and different people in countries that never even have that opportunity to get depressed about getting old.
Right. And yeah, getting old in itself is a privilege that not many people get to experience.
Yeah.
It's the line from Network. The end is getting closer than the beginning.
Yeah.
So we're really lucky to be old.
Well, then you're really, really lucky, Al, because look how old you are.
Yeah, I know. I can't wait to get your age.
I think I'm older. So.
Yeah, I know. I can't wait.
Shut up. Yeah.
Until I get as old as you. Wow. Well, that's great. And so speaking of that, when you say that, and putting things out and doubting and all that stuff, are you conscious of how people perceive you? Like, it's a really judgmental world. So you're putting stuff out there, and do you look at social media and reviews and all that sort of stuff, or do you sort of just stay away from that?
I think it's hard not to, and obviously when a book first comes out, you're really kind of thirsty for that, right? You think, what are people going to say? How's it going to be received? And I think artists kind of need that on some level. I mean, you need the good stuff, right? You need the sense that, a lot of people, hey, look, a lot of people like this book. It's sold enough copies or whatever. And I think, I don't think I'm bulletproof enough to not have that, right? If nobody liked my books or whatever, I'm not sure I'd keep going. But the first book, what was interesting about the first book about Venezuela is that I had uncovered, the book basically exposes that the Chavez government had fired on this crowd, which had been something that they had worked very hard to confuse and had an alternative narrative in the media. And so when that book came out, most of the first reviews or actions on it were from, people who were paid by the Venezuelan government to do damage control. So that was, it was your first book. That was a pretty hard punch in the nose, because at first I didn't realize that these people were, being paid to do this. So, that hurt, right? I'm not going to lie. That kind of hurt, but, it turned out fine. The Economist put it as one of their best books of the year. It was critically acclaimed, so it was all fine. But it was very disconcerting to feel like, okay, I'm this young idealistic writer, and I put all this work into this project, and then the first, round of feedback is just like, these are lies, this is all made up. This guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Don't listen to him. He's an apologist for the empire, an American gringo.
And that came from your wife.
Yeah, exactly. So, you gotta have tough skin, right? To some degree, you gotta have tough skin, I think.
I think I've gotten to the point where I just look at the overall and good enough for me. I don't want to get into it too much, because people call you all sorts of names, right? And you can get emotional about it, angry or whatever, upset. And then it sort of takes your mind off of what you're doing and why you're doing it, right? So, because, it's quite often it's not accurate.
Yes.
That's what they're called.
Yes. Right.
But anyway, so that's interesting. So listen, are you doing, do you have a website? Are you doing social media, all that stuff? Where can readers find you and say something bad about it?
Well, if you want to say something bad about me, go to House of Mystery.
Go to Joe Goldberg.
I'm happy you guys got readers. I don't even get any bad reviews. I don't have any readers. I'm impressed.
So I'm on Facebook and Instagram. Brian Nelson Author is on Facebook, and my webpage is briannelsonbooks.com. avert.com, and there's a lot of articles and shorter pieces on there and some excerpts from the book on there. So that's probably a good place to start. So
Okay.
check it out.
Yeah, we'll put all that up on our website as well and stuff like that. So, do you have who's your writer influences besides Joe?
This is easy. I can guess who it is. Yeah, not me. No, you're a Crichton guy. Tell me you're a Michael Crichton.
I am a Crichton. I was a Crichton guy. I am a Crichton guy. Absolutely. Thank you for noticing. I appreciate that. I do like very old school stuff. So a book like War of the Worlds. Very old H.G. Wells, I will look at those things meticulously because I find them very fascinating. And since you guys are, a little bit older, I'm going to mention something that you might have heard of. This is from the 70s. There was a musical version of the War of the Worlds, and it had Richard Burton in it. It had one of the guys from Tin Lizzy in it. There's all these kind of famous actors in it, and it was like the psychedelic album, like concept album that you only had back in the 70s, right? And I would listen to that thing over and over again, and it definitely made me fall in love with the catastrophe apocalypse narrative. And if you haven't heard of it or check it out because the music is actually pretty fascinating as well. But there's all these kind of strange big names attached to the concept. And they redid it a few years ago, and like Liam Neeson was like the narrator for it. So check it out. But anyway, I do have this kind of back then they didn't call it science fiction, they called it scientific romances, but like this sort of Jules Verne, H.G. Wells kind of stuff was kind of the feel I wanted to give, especially in that first book, the Last Sword Maker.
Right. Well, there is something fascinating about the older stuff. I'm totally immersed in it. I love it.
Yep.
Yeah. There's nothing better.
And plus, the end of the world is a musical comedy.
Yeah.
You turn your trilogy into a musical comedy.
That's right.
End of the world,
That's right.
Let's sing and dance our way to the end of the world.
Right. Yeah. James Missioner's South Pacific, right? You read the book and then you're like, what?
I'm gonna wash that spaceship out of my hair. Yeah. Oh, that's terrible. Anyway. Well, we appreciate you being on the show. It's been really interesting, a lot of fun, learned a lot. I've taken a lot of notes, so my next book I can write, and it'll be a great book now.
All right, fantastic.
All because of you.
No, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
So now the book we're talking about, The Great Unmaking, and it's the Course of Empire Series, Book 3, and our guest is the author of that and many other books, Brian A. Nelson. So thank you very much.
Okay, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or shows, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.